Hey, I'm Nick Tragakos, author of the Thirsty Beagle beer blog on News OK. We're here on the Pubco grounds today. We're working on a special feature that our video department is doing called The Beer That Saved the Frontier. And it's about historic chalk beer that they've made over the past 100 years down in the McAllister area. And today we're going to try our own batch, see how it turns out, and about 2 weeks from now we'll have our own historic chalk beer. There we go. So the first thing that we're doing right now is just getting our water up to a good temperature. We want to bring it up to about 155 degrees. Then we'll put our grain in there and let it rest for about an hour. What's going to happen during that hour is that the hot water will soak the grains and pull the sugars out of there. The sugar is what the yeast will eventually eat and convert into alcohol. So this is essentially the backbone of our beer. 3 pounds of crushed barley, a lot of sugars in here. Once it goes in the water and the sugars come out, that's what's going to give you the color of the beer, predominantly the flavor of the beer, and of course it'll give you the alcohol content of the beer. What I've got here is a real fine mesh bag. We'll use it to strain the grains. Back in the olden days down in Pittsburgh County, they may have used a cheesecloth or even an old pillowcase or something like that, pretty much whatever they could find. We've got our water temperature up to just a little over 155 degrees. I'm going to shut that down in about a minute and we'll let it rest at that temperature. We've got some hops now. I'm going to add them into our grain bag here. And typically you wouldn't combine the hops and the grains, but I got this recipe recommended from chalk beer brewmaster Michael Lawley. He said this is the way you should do it, so we'll incorporate it old school, mix them in there. And now comes the good part. We'll shut off our burner, take our grain, and now this is essentially like steeping a giant bag of tea. We'll just drop it right in the water. See, they're soaking in all the water there. The hops will dissolve and kind of spread around, and we'll let it sit for an hour. Move on to our next step after that. Okay, so we've been steeping our grain bag for an hour now at 150 degrees. We've hopefully extracted the sugars we were looking to extract. Our next objective right now is to pick up our grain bag and to strain all the liquid out of there that we can. So the slow process starts. Now this liquid we have right now, it's not yet beer, it's what they would call wort. Essentially it's just a sugary water. It's the perfect food for our yeast to come in and start going to lunch on. Following Michael Lawley's recipe, we are not going to boil today. We're going to go straight to an ice bath from here to get the beer down to a temperature where we can add yeast. Now that's could introduce or allow some bacteria to stay in the wort, and what that could do is maybe give a little sourness or tartness to the beer. But back in the day, maybe you didn't have a lot of control over how you were making it, and that's one of the byproducts you would get. So we're going to roll with it and just kind of see how this thing turns out in the end. We've got our beer in our ice bath now. It's at about 142 degrees, give or take. We're trying to get it down to 70 degrees, which is the ideal temperature that we want to add our yeast. You don't want it to be too hot when you add your yeast because it'll kill the yeast, and then you won't end up with beer. You'll just end up with some yeasty tasting sugar water, essentially. So this process will take several minutes. It's one of those times where you can just kind of sit tight and take it easy. So in this beer, it's a 5-gallon batch, and we have only used 3 pounds of grain. Your typical homebrew batch, you're going to use somewhere between 9 and 12, maybe up to 15 pounds of grain for a 5-gallon batch. So what we're going to do to bring more sugar in there, to give the yeast more food, is just add some sugar. This is regular old table sugar you get at the grocery store. And I'm going to just pop this in there and stir it up. Okay, so we've got our wort now chilled down to right at 70 degrees. What I'm going to do now is transfer it to the sanitized bucket that I have right here. Now normally if I was brewing at home, I would have sort of like a tube and siphon sort of set up and very kind of gently transfer it over to the next bucket. But because we're going kind of old school frontier style here, I'm going to go real crude and just pour it into the next bucket. And you would have seen some sediment and stuff at the very bottom. That's just remnants of the grains and the hops that we put in that'll go in there. As the beer ages, those will all fall to the bottom, and we'll probably end up with a pretty clear, beer, and you wouldn't see all that gunk in there that we just poured in there. Now we're going to move on to our next step, which is adding the yeast. We're going to snip the yeast and then just pour it kind of evenly around the surface of the wort here. This is where the magic is made. So now I'm going to take my spoon here, incorporate the yeast, get it all mixed in there. This is serving two purposes. Not only is it getting the yeast all throughout the beer, but this rapid agitation is bringing in some oxygen too, which will help the yeast work. Now that we've got the yeast in, the next step is just put our lid on, seal it up, get it airtight, and let it go to work. What this will do is it will allow carbon dioxide to come out, and once the yeast starts working and releasing carbon dioxide, this will bubble, but it stops oxygen from getting in, which at this point we want to keep the oxygen out so that the beer is not contaminated. And that's it. We've got our beer made. It'll take a week to 2 weeks. The yeast will work, it'll ferment, and at that point we'll be ready to bottle. So that's new school, old school chalk beer. Okay, so it's been about 2 weeks since we brewed our old style chalk beer, and now we've moved on to the next phase in turning the beer around, which is the bottling. So what we're going to do now is transfer the beer from its fermenter bucket here into the bottling bucket. Now I've already sanitized this. I've already put in our sugar solution that's going to help the beer carbonate in the bottle. I've got our bottles here. These are already sanitized. We have some siphoning equipment over here that we're going to use, and this is kind of a slow process because you just let gravity take it down into the bottling bucket. But it's good to do it that way because you can use the tap here on the bucket to help really control how you fill the bottles. So one end in the bucket, the other end up here. I want to make sure that's pointed the right way. And we push down to start the flow. You can really see as the beer comes through the tube here that it's a really pale, light-colored beer. And that's something I would expect. We use a very small amount of grain, and that's what's going to give the beer its color predominantly is the type of grain that you use. We have a light-colored and small amount of grain, so you would naturally expect a pretty light golden color for this beer. Okay, so we finished siphoning the beer from the fermenter into the bottling bucket. I'll stick all this here for cleanup in a minute. So now we get the bottling bucket up. Positioned kind of right by the edge here. If I was at home in my kitchen, I'd do this right in front of the dishwasher. And you just pop the dishwasher open. So anything that would spill or fall out, a homebrew tip for you, goes right into the dishwasher, no mess. You don't have to clean anything up. You just close the dishwasher when you're done. For now, I'll just put this towel down here. But we've got our sanitized bottles. And that's real simple. Just open the spigot on this. Fill it with beer and close it up. And in about 7 to 10 days, this thing should carbonate up nicely and we'll have a properly carbonated drinkable beer.